I'm happy to be here. I love this topic. So when Caleb asked me to talk about, practical ideas, implications for intercultural business communication, I was happy to say yes. I teach an undergraduate class in intercultural communication and have traveled, maybe not as extensively as Caleb has, but have traveled. And our whole family is connected to Guatemala. We love going to Guatemala. We've been there. My husband's been there several times. He leads cross-cultural groups there. And so this is a topic that's near and dear to my heart, and I love to talk about it. So I do want to hear from you too a little bit. But I do have a question to start. Did anybody print off the tips? Great. Okay, I don't need them. I just wanted to, if I ask you to give me some of those tips, I didn't want you all just staring at me saying, well, they're on our computer. So, all right. On the morning of August 5th, 1997, the captain of Korean Air Flight 801 woke up at 6. He went through his normal day. He was in Seoul, Korea. And he was getting ready to fly to Gimpo International Airport. At 7 p.m. that same day, the captain, his first officer, and the flight engineer met and collected the trip's paperwork. They would be flying a Boeing 747, the model known in the aviation world as the Classic. The aircraft was in perfect working order. It had once been the Korean presidential plane. Flight 801 departed the gate at 10:30 in the evening and was airborne 20 minutes later. Takeoff was without incident. Just before 1:30 in the morning, the plane broke out of the clouds and the flight crew glimpsed lights off in the distance. "Is it Guam?" the flight engineer asked. Then after a pause, he said, "It's Guam, it's Guam." The captain chuckled, "Good." The plane began its descent. They would make a visual approach, the captain said. He had flown into Guam Airport from Gimpo 8 times previously. Most recently, a month ago, he knew the airport and the surrounding terrain. The landing gear went down. The flaps were extended 10 degrees. The captain said, "Wiper on." The flight engineer turned them on. It was raining. The first officer said, "Not in sight." He was looking for the runway. He couldn't see it. 1 second later, the ground proximity warning system called out in its electronic voice, 500 feet. The plane was 500 feet off the ground. But how could that be if they couldn't see the runway? 2 seconds passed. The flight engineer said, "Eh?" in an astonished tone of voice. At 1:42 and 19 seconds, the first officer said, "Let's make a missed approach," meaning let's pull up and make a large circle and try the landing again. 1 second later, the flight engineer said, "Not in sight." The first officer added, "Not in sight, missed approach." At 01:42 and 22 seconds, the flight engineer said again, "Go around." The captain repeated, "Go around," but he was slow to pull the plane out of its descent. The plane hit the side of a hill, a densely vegetated mountain 3 miles south of the airport. The plane skidded for 2,000 feet, severing an oil pipeline and snapping pine trees before falling into a ravine and bursting into flames. By the time rescue workers reached the crash site, 228 of the 254 people on board were dead. Does anybody know what they now know caused this accident? I'm going to leave you in suspense. Okay?
I was going to say lack of communication. The breakdown in communication.
You got it. We're dismissed.
I'm going to say alcohol.
That's the new movie. That's the new movie. That's from Outliers, Malcolm Gladwell's book Outliers, which is a phenomenal book, by the way. And we will get back to that, okay? So intercultural concepts, what do we need to know and why? We need to know what we don't know. Okay, that might seem like that, duh, makes a lot of sense, but sometimes we forget that we don't know certain things. And we assume that we know a lot more than we do. And you've heard of the ugly American going overseas, and there's a reason that it's called the ugly American, because of the verbal and nonverbal things that we do that are not appropriate in certain situations. So we need to know what we don't know. And I want to make this very practical. So what I want to do in the next 45 minutes or so that we have together is talk about the concepts that I think, in a nutshell, What do we need to know? And how does that translate into very practical ways to communicate, especially in business interculturally? So we need to know what we don't know. We need to know that we can't know everything. And this is one of the first things that I tell my students in the undergrad class, because it can start to be overwhelming when you hear examples and you read, well, in this culture you need to do this, and in this culture this, and you need to know this if you're going here, but if it's this religion then you need to know this, and so it gets overwhelming. We can't know everything. We just can't. And so we have to know what we need to know. So we need to be able to find out what we don't know. It'd be nice if we had somebody who could always brief us, like the president is supposed to have, and our presidents haven't always had that. I remember when this happened. Now it's ended up in textbooks on intercultural communication, when George Bush Sr. was down under in Australia and gave the V for victory salute, which there meant the middle finger.
Oh.
And yeah. And
You didn't know that? No.
And I've cut him a lot of slack for that, because somebody should have told him. The president can't know everything. The president needs to be briefed about different cultural customs and what's appropriate and what's not. And one of the first things you need to know when you go to a different culture is what gestures are appropriate and what gestures are not. And so, I don't know if somebody got fired over that. I never did find out, but.
Would that, well, I don't know.
No, that's okay.
Would that be in a briefing though? Because like you said, you can't know everything.
Oh.
So they probably said, well, you gotta sit here, you gotta say this. But like, they're not gonna go through all the obscene gestures. I don't know.
If he's in a parade though?
Okay.
Yeah.
He was in a parade,
Yeah.
okay.
Yeah, sorry, maybe I didn't say that. Yeah, and it's like, okay, there are certain things that we're going to have to tell you. There are certain things that we need to know about eye contact and gesture, some of those. Yeah, so, and you can think of it in terms, I teach speech classes too, so you can think of it in terms of public speaking. What do I need to know about voice and movement? And so somebody should be doing that research and should be briefing that person. Now, it would be nice if we all had somebody to brief us, but we don't. So what are those essentials that we need to know? And again, we can't know everything. So when we're going to a specific place, then we need to do research on that. Another thing that we need to know is the degree to which we are ethnocentric. And I do tell students that if there is only one word that you come out with in an intercultural communication class, it's ethnocentrism. What is ethnocentrism?
You're the only person. Self,
Yeah.
It's about me.
Yeah.
I only exist.
Yeah. And when you're talking about it culturally, it's about my culture. My culture is the best. My culture is what I like to call the standard bearer. Yeah, so all other cultures are measured against my culture. And we can be taught that from a very early age, and it doesn't have to be a bad thing to be patriotic, but it can turn bad when we don't recognize the value of other cultures. And so ethnocentrism is huge. It's so easy for us to measure standards of other cultures against our own cultures. And again, that's not always bad, but we have to recognize that sometimes we don't value things that we should be valuing because we're too ethnocentric. And then to know your audience. Again, this comes out of speech, but knowing our audience is so important. And so how do we do that? Well, I want to go into some of just the very basic and major intercultural concepts. Hofstede, have any of you heard of Hofstede? Well, you did if you read that actually, because Hofstede was all over that one. So his dimensions have been around for a long time, and this is kind of the nuts and bolts of intercultural communication, and then I want us to relate it to some of the very practical ideas that were in the PDF that you had for class today. So Hofstede's dimensions, power distance. I want to explain these, and a lot of you might know what these are already, so then this will be a nice review, but these should be our cheat sheet when we are dealing with people from other cultures. And I think the stakes are always high when you're dealing with someone from another culture, because you want to do that effectively. I mean, I teach a lot of communication classes, and it's hard to have effective and ethical communication with people who are from our own cultures and from our own co-cultures. And so we have trouble with that kind of communication. We have trouble with communication within our own families and with our closest friends. So you know the degree to which then we can have trouble with communication with people from other cultures. So this is kind of the, okay, what do I need to remember? I need to, when I'm dealing with someone in business or in whatever kind of a context, in intercultural communication, I need to be aware of power distance. And that is the degree, we talk about, you can talk about high and low power distance. Power distance is usually talked about in terms of the words small and large. And so power distance deals with what? What is it?
Perceived strength. Or
Yeah.
lack of strength.
And it's it deals with hierarchy. So who has the power? What's the hierarchy? And the United States is known as a low power distance culture. Okay, so a low power distance culture says that hierarchy is not valued as much. Now, when you talk about any of these dimensions, you could say, yeah, but in the United States or in my company, there's this real hierarchy. But when we're talking about studying this in the context of other cultures and how other cultures do business. And in that context, the United States is known as a low or a small power distance culture. So we can be very approachable people, and when you're looking at a hierarchy in a company, you can have people who approach the president of the company. And in other cultures, you don't do that. And so you have to know the degree to which a culture values small or large power distance. In one of my classes, I like the students to take a look at John Chambers, the CEO of Cisco with a C, and he's very much into small power distance. He has an office just like all the rest of his employees. He flies. He said anybody who's flying will not fly first class unless they want to pay for it themselves, including me. And so he's very much into small power distance. But there are a lot of cultures where that is not the way it is. And so we have to recognize that. So if we're used to, to somebody, you can slap them on the back, or you can, just be very informal. We're talking about formal versus informal. You have to be very aware of what might be very inappropriate in other cultures. So can somebody give me just a couple of the very practical ideas that were mentioned with power distance on there?
Superiors treat subordinates with respect and do not pull rank.
Yeah, yes. What else?
Liberal democracies are the norm.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, give me one more. What's another one?
Managers may often socialize with subordinates.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so we need to know, are we dealing with another culture where it's a large power distance, and we have to make sure that we're not that as familiar as we might feel like we can be, because there can be major faux pas otherwise. And you can make or break business deals depending on your awareness of this and how you handle it. Okay, so let's get back. Let's make sure this is working here.
Malcolm, when you talk about what succeeds, some of what you talk about in terms of success and failure is not just the individuals, because as you say, that doesn't seem dominant. It's the environment around them.
No.
The culture around them. And some cultures, national cultures, seem better and worse.
Yeah.
You found that, by and large, Koreans were very bad at being pilots. Explain
that. Being a good pilot, we think, is a matter of technical skill. It isn't really.
But what about Sully Sullenberger?
Well, he's such an outlier to the theory of outliers. That's a very rare kind of plane crash. In fact, I don't know if there'd ever been a successful water landing in the last 50 years. Most crashes have a very different form. The overwhelming majority of crashes are the result of a breakdown in communication between the co-pilot and the pilot. Something comes up, a situation emerges that requires those two pilots to be in open and honest communication, and they fail to do that. One person withholds information, one person doesn't share, whatever. They're invariably social failures. So the question is, this is why there's a cultural component. Is it easier in some cultures for a subordinate to speak openly and honestly to his superior than in other cultures? And the answer is absolutely. In fact, this is one of the dimensions on which cultures vary the most. It's called power distance, right? It is the respect for hierarchy. And there are some cultures that have zero respect for hierarchy, and some cultures that are, for which that is the dominant paradigm of social interaction. Korea, as it happens, is a culture which has enormous respect for hierarchy, where power distance is in fact, the entire linguistic structure of the Korean language is infused with this sense of, how do I treat you if you are older and superior to me? I use specific pronounal forms. I mean, it goes on and on and on, right? Well, that is in 99% of cases, a beautiful and wonderful thing. In the cockpit, it's a problem, right? And so you see, whenever you see cultures, if you overlay the list of cultures in the world by their respect for power distance with the list of cultures in the world by their plane crashes per capita, it's basically the same list.
So it's the ones that are hierarchical that have the most plane crashes.
That have the most plane crashes. So you'll see, so classic,
And what did Korean Airlines do?
Well, this is the second part of this argument, which is, this is not to say that certain cultures are incapable of doing that task. It just means that if they want to get better, they have to address the cultural component of their interaction. And that's exactly what Korean Air did. And they fixed their problem. Today, Korean Air was, through the 90s, one of the most dangerous airlines in the world. I mean, it was almost shut down at the end of the 90s by international aviation authorities. The Canadians told them at one point, you can't fly over Canada anymore. I mean, which is a real problem if you're trying to get from one end of the world to the other. And they fixed it. And they fixed it by bringing in people who have a different cultural attitude and essentially re-educating the pilots in Korean Airlines.
And they made them speak in English because they said it's a non-hierarchical language.
It's a non-hierarchical language. They wanted to think like, I mean, non-hierarchical cultures are America, Israel, Austria, Australia. They wanted them to think like Australians, essentially, right? What do? Well, you make them speak English, right? And it works. I mean, this is the sort of hopeful lesson at the core of my book, which is that when we acknowledge how much of success is embedded in culture, that's a hopeful thing because culture is malleable. It's something we can address if we put our minds to it.
So when you look at America today, what elements of our culture are producing the kind of problems we see? I mean, we have a bad education system, for example.
Yeah. I think that we have carried, in the educational realm, we have carried our obsession with individualism too far. And paradoxically, we have an enormous amount to learn, I think, from Asian cultures like Korea. I mean, just as they can learn from us on flying planes, we can learn from them on education. If you go to Korea or China or Hong Kong and you ask them, what does it take to be good at math? Their answer would be, being good at math is a function of how hard you work, right? Now, hard work is something that is available to all students, regardless of intellectual ability. So when you come in with that perspective, your expectation is everyone can work. The dull child can work as hard as, in fact, the dull child may find it easier to work harder than the smart child. That work-based perspective on achievement allows you, I think, to serve the needs of a much broader pool of students than we have an ability-based approach, right? We're constantly segregating kids according to their aptitude, right? Whatever on earth that is. I think we do well to banish that word and simply, I think we should separate kids according to how hard they want to work. The kids who want to do their homework ought to be in one, and if you don't want to do your homework, I think we should say, then you have a problem. And we should, I don't care if you have an IQ of 150, you have a problem, you have.
Okay. All right. He got into a little bit of the next one, which is why I wanted to play that last part of it. But basically, back to the airplane crashes, that was a power distance situation where the co-pilot was respecting the pilot, and so it was inappropriate to say certain orders to him in a certain tone of voice. And it's unbelievable when you read. I encourage you, if you're interested in this, to get that book and read especially that particular chapter, because it goes through several different airplane crashes and it goes through dialogue that shows you low power distance, high power distance being, or large power distance being played out. And you say, how is that possible that the intercultural, the dimension, the Hofstede dimension of power distance is how you explain that plane crash? That's hard to take. And so it's fascinating, but it's also so tragic. He got into individualism versus collectivism a little bit at the end of that clip, and if I had to pick a favorite dimension, it would probably be this one as far as what I like to talk about, because I think there's so many clues here to ineffective intercultural communication and then how we can be more effective. In the Western world, we are an individualistic society. So tell me can you think of any phrases or anything that would indicate how individualistic we are in the United States, in the Western world? Yeah, yeah. All for one, one for all. What?
Me against the world.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Me first.
Mm-hmm.
There's a magazine called Self.
Yeah, right. There's a big one right here. I, that's an I. I versus we. Individualism, collectivism. Tell me how this can impact how we do business. How can this impact how somebody from an individualistic culture does business with someone from a collectivistic culture? What happens there?
You'll have more buy-in with we than you're going to with I.
Mm-hmm. More buy-in with we than I.
It could be perceived as selfish and unable to work together with you.
Mm-hmm.
Condescending.
Mm-hmm.
All those kind of negative feelings.
Mm-hmm.
Supposed to, why aren't they like us more?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Anything else?
I think there's a pros and cons to either direction. From the I perspective, I mean, you can possibly have a great leadership development versus the group dynamic where it's kind of difficult to really see leadership more. It's more driven as a group versus a leader kind of running the business and casting a vision. So,
Yeah. Yeah.
one direction.
No, I'm glad you said that, because when I talk about it, I tend to get into dissing the individualistic culture a little bit. I appreciate there are values to both. It is so important for us, and impossible to some extent, but we have to try to empathize with those who are from a different cultural context than we are, and especially in terms of individualism versus collectivism. So people who are from individualistic societies are going to do business very differently than people from collectivistic societies. And one of the things that correlates, and you'll see correlation as we talk about these different dimensions, but one of the correlations to an I culture is impatience. People from I cultures want things to happen much more quickly than people from we cultures. That's how it tends to work. I know I'm speaking in generalities. There are always going to be exceptions to these, but if you're trying to, conceptualize these, you would look at people from we cultures being more process-oriented. So on a very practical level, people from I cultures need to understand that a lot of times the collectivistic culture, the we culture, you need to, if I can say it this way, you need to court them a little bit more. You need to slow the process down. People from the States, for example, tend to want, let's just get that done. Let's just go in and get it done. And you have to understand that if you're dealing with someone from a collectivistic culture, then you do need to say, wait, there might be a system here that we have to go through. There might be a process. And then we go back to, we have to find out what that is and what's appropriate. And certain cultures, there's a whole body of knowledge and research out there on gift giving in the business setting. What are appropriate gifts? What are not appropriate gifts? There are certain cultures where you should not give a certain color of a certain gift. Should the gift be wrapped or unwrapped? Should the person open it when you give it to them, or is that rude? Different cultures have different ideas, different customs for how we do that. And so, we might say, well, I'm going to give them this gift and I'm waiting for them to open it, but for them to open it, it would be rude. And so we need to understand what that other culture expects. And this is how I look at it. A lot of literature goes this way, but if you're going to the other culture, then it's your responsibility. And if somebody is coming to your culture, it's their responsibility. But they might not necessarily see it that way. So our responsibility as individuals and in our own corporations is to always be one step ahead. So what do I need to know? And what can I do? And there's a very important word there. What can I do to help another culture save face? Face is a very important concept, more so in a collectivistic culture. And so what is face? Saving face. What is that?
Respect, dignity.
So I'm going to try to protect you so that you still have the respect of the group. And individualistic cultures don't pay as much attention to the whole idea of face. So the whole idea of face and of gift giving is written about and talked about a lot in business, in doing business with other cultures. So it's hard for people from an individualistic culture to wrap their minds around what it is like to think in terms of the group rather than the individual. And that, and vice versa. And that impacts how, I mean, think of it, when you're talking about a collectivistic culture, we value teamwork in individualistic cultures. But collectivistic cultures look at that in a totally different way and on a different level than we do. And so that's a really important factor to look at. Looking at teamwork and what does that mean to a collectivistic culture? And what does that mean to an individualistic culture? And you can assess that easily from the I versus we language. How much we language is there? How much I language is there? Okay, there's two more. Hofstede has 4 dimensions. Uncertainty avoidance, high versus low. Uncertainty avoidance is the degree to which the culture wants to avoid uncertainty. It's kind of easy, right? The degree to which they want to avoid uncertainty. The United States is known as what? Where are we on that uncertain? We okay with uncertainty more than other cultures? Yes, we are. Yes. Individualistic cultures correlate with low uncertainty avoidance. We don't mind uncertainty as much as collectivistic cultures correlate more with high uncertainty avoidance. Okay, so here's a list, just a few. I mean, you could take every culture and put them somewhere on these dimensions. Okay, so what we're looking at with uncertainty avoidance is countries are most reliant on rules and plans and most likely to stick to procedure regardless of circumstance. Those are the cultures that want to avoid uncertainty, high uncertainty avoidance, okay? So high uncertainty avoidance, the culture that comes out number 1 on a lot of these lists is Greece. And then the top 5, Greece, Portugal, Guatemala, Uruguay, and Belgium. The bottom 5, the cultures best able to tolerate ambiguity, that's another way to say it, are Hong Kong, Sweden, Denmark, Jamaica, and Singapore has been studied as the least. Very low uncertainty avoidance. And so why would that be important to know about a culture when you're doing business with a culture? Give me an example. It can be specific or general.
Maybe as far as contract negotiations, something, get to kind of know those things as far as, how to finalize negotiations.
Mm-hmm.
Some countries that may say, well, we don't have to kind of have all the details now, we can do it later versus maybe with the American coach, you want to have all the details finalized right now.
Right. Right, all our T's crossed and our I's dotted, and another one goes, hey, we shook and we're good.
Yeah, exactly.
Work it all out later. Yeah, exactly. And we need to know who we're dealing with and what the expectations are because, again, we might have certain expectations and they have very different expectations, and that can make or break our business deals. Masculine versus feminine culture. This one is the most it's the most misunderstood of Hofstede's dimensions. So tell me, it's misunderstood because we take the masculine word and the feminine word and we put different interpretations on than Hofstede actually did when he was studying that. And so give me, that was on that sheet. Give me some examples of a masculine culture. Assertive. A feminine culture is what? Give me a word for a feminine culture.
Family-centered.
Yeah, yeah. Mm-hmm. Relationship. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
More flexible time.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. You know, so, yeah, because some people have trouble like, well, I think of myself as a masculine man, you know, and not me, but I mean, people say that. And they can say, but I'm in a feminine culture. There are Latin American cultures that are known as feminine cultures where you can have a very, very strong male role model. So that's why this one's misunderstood and studied a lot. So it's important to know what kind of a culture. Is this more of a feminine culture? Is this more of a masculine culture? In those terms in which Hofstede was describing them. And I think you can start to see even more correlation with power distance, individualism, uncertainty avoidance, masculine versus feminine cultures. So let's just do an example here. A culture that is individualistic, where is going to be more low uncertainty avoidance. Does that make sense? They don't mind. Okay, yeah, so you see there's lots of correlations with these. Okay, now the other factors that I think are really important, along with Hofstede is Hall, and it's nice because they both have H's so you can remember them, but Edward T. Hall has done so much work in cultural factors. He's done a lot with the nonverbal. Very famous with all his research in nonverbal for several decades now. But Edward T. Hall has talked about the cultural factors of context, time, and space. And we'll unpack those very quickly because those go right along with Hofstede's dimensions. And sometimes people think of context in terms of Hofstede's dimensions, but they're not. They're Edward T. Hall's high context versus low context. And crucial to know high context versus low context when you're doing business with people of another culture. Okay, so the United States is known as a low context culture, and the best way to remember this, if you're not familiar with this wording, is that low context equals direct communication, and high context equals indirect communication. And this one's the hardest one for people to get the actual terminology correct, because it can seem a little counterintuitive. So high context means that you find out what that culture is about by observing context. It's going to be more indirect. People are not going to say things straight out. And so Asian cultures are known to be more high context. Western cultures are known to be more low context, and so much more direct. And you don't have to take into consideration, although I teach the importance of context all the time, you have to understand the context. In the Western world, in the United States, we are known more as a low context. We're much more direct. We're going to tell you what we think. It's going to be written down. The rules will be written down. They'll be clear, or if they're not, we'll tell you. With a high context, you might not know. You have to figure it out. So you might
explains why our syllabus is 25 pages.
Yes. No question. No, yeah. So somebody from a low context culture can have a lot of trouble doing business with someone from a high context culture. You can get really frustrated with this. Because like, well, how are we supposed to know this? And how are we supposed to know the pomp and circumstance involved? And how are we supposed to know that at this first meeting, all we were doing was having a meal together, but you don't talk about business? That would be more a high context culture. There are certain rules, there's certain protocol that's more extreme than in a low context culture. And so high context is correlated more with collectivism. High context is correlated more with large power distance. Not always, but often correlated that way. High context and low context has been studied a lot, but again, the best way to understand that is direct versus indirect. So low context, more direct culture, high context, more indirect. You can see how that would play out then in a business setting with the language that people use. In a high context culture, you might not know nearly as well what people are thinking as in a low context. I mean, they will actually lie to you, but they won't. In your low context mind, it will seem like it will sound exactly like a lie. In their high context mind, they're helping save face, and they wouldn't see it as a lie, but as what is socially appropriate to protect all parties involved. Does that make sense? I got some nods. Okay. All right.
Would it be bad to say that my family is one way and my in-laws are another way? Because you've listed all the things that I observed from both families.
Because many
Very
of the
interesting.
things that you brought up aren't, while they are very much intercultural, I also see them
Yeah.
across personalities, introversion versus extroversion, thinker versus
Right.
feeler. I mean,
Right.
there's while these can span oceans, they can also just span
Right.
driveways.
Oh, that's true. Yeah. And when you look at intercultural, and when you're looking at cultures, you're looking at as a whole, what are we observing? And we're at an interesting time in our culture in the States, those of us who have grown up in the United States, is that this is pretty dynamic right now. This is starting to change. One thing that this is just a different example of what we're talking about, but something that I've been interested in for a long time is that in the 60s, there were a lot of studies about gender differences in the workplace, and they started to find out that those studies weren't making as much sense as they thought they were, and they realized that it wasn't about gender, it was about the hierarchy in the company. So it was like, well, wait a minute, this isn't playing out. If this woman is promoted to a CEO, then this study doesn't work anymore, and it was about the position in the company, not the gender. So all of this is pretty dynamic right now. This is going to start to change. They're going to have to, the scholars in intercultural communication are going to have to start taking a look at this with the demographics of the United States and how that's changing. And so, yeah, although we can look at all of this and say, well, yeah, I've got this in my family just like this, people study cultures as a whole, and there will be within those cultures and within those families, definitely. I find this useful for analyzing a lot of different contexts, definitely. Time is a huge factor, actually, when you're talking about business on a very practical level. And there's polychronic versus monochronic time. And the polychronic time is, and this is where you can have the same argument that we just had. The United States is known as a monochronic time culture. That's a very scheduled kind of a culture. Class meets at 5:45, and we're going to get here at 5:45, and in this culture to wander in at 6:30 probably isn't appropriate. Weddings are the best one to look at with these cultural weddings. And still in the United States, in a lot of the United States, if a wedding starts at 2, it's going to start at 2. But in other cultures, the starting time is really a time for people to start thinking about going to that event. Maybe they'll show up an hour or 2 later. And so that's polychronic time. Well, I like productivity and efficiency, and when I first learned these years and years ago, the way I remembered them, because my name is Mary, I thought monochronic Mary. Okay, that's easy, because I'm so scheduled. That's going to be an easy way. I didn't like the word that people correlated, though, to remember polychronic, and that was people. They care more about people. I went, no, I just want people to be on time. So polychronic correlates more with high context. It correlates even more with collectivistic cultures. Monochronic correlates more with individualistic. Those correlations aren't always clean, okay? But you see how this would greatly impact how people do business. Okay, we're going to start a meeting at 2 o'clock. You get there, how come nobody's here? We're in a polychronic culture. Well, what can you do with that? It goes back to ethnocentrism. You go, I'm mad, they're not here, this is rude, I can't believe they don't value my time. It's not how they're looking at it at all. Hey, we had this other thing and we're going to preserve face and we're with this person and this relationship is very important, but then we can turn around and argue, I think relationships are important, but still I'm a product of a monochronic culture, and I tend to think if you're not on time, that's rude. Somebody from that's a whole different mindset, somebody from a polychronic culture. And people who do business in a polychronic culture might see that very differently than we see it. Now, what's interesting, though, with globalization, our global community, is that just like what happened with the Korean Airlines, what happened? It all went to one language, and that language was English. Okay, so a lot of people now around the world are trying to do business by the standards of the people who do business in the United States. And they're also, and it's really interesting because you've got the United States that's an individualistic culture, low power distance. You've got people also looking at China as a major power here for business, which is about the opposite of all of these in intercultural communication language and terminology. So you look at that and you can see where there's going to be problems worldwide with, wait a minute, what standards of business do we go by? And how do we do business given all these different cultural differences? So, and then the other one is space. Edward T. Hall's done most of most of the research that we're familiar with on space, the use of space. And they've actually, if you've seen this before, he has the actual inches, like 0 to 18 inches is intimate space, and so, and then you've got your social space, but that's culturally dependent. It's culturally specific. And part of that is population. When you grow up in a more crowded culture, then you're going to have people who don't value your personal space as much as you might. So they're right there. They're right there next to you, and it's like, don't touch me. But that's very appropriate in some cultures. One of the examples in business that I read in the Arab culture is that you can be sitting with someone who owns a company in the Arab world, and they're sitting next to you doing business, and they have their hand on your knee, and you're going, okay, I'm really uncomfortable about that, but that's totally appropriate in that culture. Good to know. Not going there, not doing business there.
I'm trying to import that here.
So, kind of by way of summary here, of going back to that very first point of what do we need to know, this is something that's really commonly talked about in intercultural communication, is that cultural iceberg. You've probably heard of this before, but another way to look at cultural iceberg is what is also called the deep structure of a culture, or the deep structure of a society. And it's that whole idea where, and I have no clue why that's not working. There it is. All right, the cultural iceberg. So what we observe about a culture is those things that we observe, that very small part that's above the surface. And then there are so many things that we need to be aware of. So we come full circle then. We need to be aware of all these things that are underneath the culture. And all cultures have this, but it's even more difficult sometimes to determine in a high context culture. You can ask people more about these things in a low context culture. That's more culturally appropriate. We ask people things. We can be pretty direct in our culture with certain things that other people would not be direct about at all. Okay? So here are some, and you look at things like economics, family, educational system, you've got the media, and popular culture. That it's not said that way, but popular culture. history, and then there's a big one right there, religion. And one of my biggest criticisms of most of the intercultural texts that I've seen and used is that a lot of them don't have any sections on religion. It's such a huge area of intercultural communication, and yet really hard to find in intercultural communication textbooks. That's a huge gap, because one of the things that's so important to know, and it's important to know in business, is what is the religion? I mean, you can have some real faux pas with that. You know, you can, during certain high religious times, and you've got to be really careful. What do they value? You can't diss that, even if you feel like it, even if you don't agree. You need to be aware of some of the basics of the religion of the person or the company. The company sometimes can be a very religious company. And so what are some of those things that we might need to know? You know, in a direct culture, you really can have somebody say, "What? Tell me about that hat you're wearing. What's that little cap you're wearing?" I mean, that would be so inappropriate for some people to hear. And yet there are people who kind of pride themselves at how blunt they are. That's individualistic culture, people. You're not going to find that. You're not going to find that very much in a collectivistic culture. So you look at the attitudes that drive the culture, the core values, and those can be very hard to find. I mean, some people will say to you, some people will answer the question, how in the world am I supposed to know all this? They will answer it by saying, live here for a few years. And be pretty quiet while you do live here and observe. Because that's one of the things that the ugly Americans do, is that they forget to observe, and they go in like a bull in a china shop, and they're so inappropriate. I mean, that's one of our negative stereotypes, is that we can be so inappropriate. And so we need to do our homework. We need to know those attitudes, those core values. And we can get it wrong sometimes, but people appreciate that you've tried. That's pretty standard and pretty universal from what I found, is that people appreciate when you've tried, and that includes trying a little bit of the language. They'll have a whole lot of fun when you're wrong, but they really appreciate that you're at least trying. But that's another one, is to be briefed a little bit on, is there anything I need to know about the language in this culture? Like, is there a word? See, we need to know what questions to ask. Like, okay, I'm going to Guatemala. Is there a word in Spanish that's really close to a word in English that I need to be aware of so that I don't say it? And there are things like that, and they could say, well, no, not really. Or they could say that to mess with you. But it's important to know, what are some words maybe that I should avoid? What are some very basics? I taught a class. It was a week residency class in Guatemala last year, and we did a slide of, here's just some basic, excuse me, how do you say excuse me, how do you say how much, how do you greet? And that's just being polite, is to know some very basics, and that doesn't have to take you very long to know. Well, it depends on the language. It's a lot easier in Spanish to learn those things than it is for a country that doesn't even share the same alphabet. We spent 3 weeks in Greece years ago, my husband and I, and that was difficult. The woman who was our host there, she was born in Greece. And I said to her one time, I said, well, we always say, she lived in the States for a long time too, and her English was great. And I said, the Greek language is so complicated. She said, seriously, you think the Greek language is complicated? You try to understand the differences among angle, ankle, uncle, angel. Never thought of that. Angle, ankle, uncle, angel. She said, it's almost impossible sometimes to understand your language. And I said, okay, so when we don't understand something, we say it's all Greek to me. And I said, what do you say? She said, we say it's all Chinese to me. Yeah. It's all Chinese to me. All right, so I love the whole idea of spiritual practices. I am cultivating spiritual practices for intercultural business. So I'll leave you with just some ideas that I think are really helpful for us. And that is patience. and I correlate these with a spiritual practice: patience with ourselves and with others, acceptance of ourselves and others, humility. A good dose of humility does not hurt us in intercultural communication. And then how do we do that? I think it's really important. I mean, you can't have patience with somebody, including yourself, and it's hard to accept somebody, including yourself, without awareness. I think it's really important to have awareness of self and others. Understand a little history of the place that you're going. Understand the history of the culture. Well, and you know, I've talked in terms of going somewhere, but we talk a lot in intercultural communication about co-cultures, and the co-culture is the culture within the culture, which it used to be called subculture, but we don't use that. You will rarely find the word subculture in a text anymore. And it's co-culture. And so the co-culture is the culture within the dominant culture. We have a lot of co-cultures that we do business with that require intercultural communication skills. And it's really beneficial to us to read a little bit about that culture, to read a little bit about that business, to understand a little bit about the religion of that of that person or that culture or that business. And then I think it's really important to take a look at Scripture and Jesus' model for his interaction, because Jesus used different styles depending on the people he was interacting with. He interacted very differently with the Pharisees, with the religious leaders of the day, than he did with the woman at the well. And so it goes back to knowing our audience. What style do we use? What's appropriate for this context? What do I need to know? And then for me, one of the biggest ones is cultivating the practice of just waiting. Waiting, especially if you're monochronic Mary like me. Waiting can help you to value polychronic time a whole lot more. And when you're trying to understand someone and do business with someone of another culture, sometimes what we need to know the most is patience. And the path to patience is learning how to wait. So one of the books that I read a long time ago on spiritual practices said one of the best ways to cultivate patience and waiting is to get behind a slow driver on the road and get in a long line at a grocery store. And for someone from a monochronic culture who's really bought into that, that's really hard for me. But those are some of the things that can really help us to cultivate what it takes to understand people from other cultures. So I would encourage you to remember Hofstede's dimensions, to remember power distance, to remember individualism versus collectivism, to remember what else? Masculine versus feminism, the uncertainty avoidance, and then Hall's high versus low context, time, space, and ethnocentrism, to say, okay, what are those things I need to remember? What are those things I need to keep in mind when I'm dealing with people from other cultures and from co-cultures? So, any questions? Thank you.